We're here having a conversation with Dr. Bruce King about the transformational change for schools doing work with authentic intellectual work. This is part 2 of multi-series of short presentations that introduce people to the work that the Center for AIW has been doing. So welcome, Dr. King. Thanks for being here.
Hi, Dana. Thanks. Hi, everybody.
First, if you could just give a brief overview of the background of this framework for authentic intellectual work.
Sure. Back in the early 90s, Fred Newman directed a research center at the University of Wisconsin that looked at school reform and school restructuring, and our major challenge was to address the question, for all this reform and changes going on in schools, what difference does it make in terms of classroom practice, and then in turn, what difference does that make in terms of student achievement? Our way of measuring that in our research was through the framework for authentic intellectual work. You can see the 3 main criteria for AIW in the rows of construction of knowledge, discipline inquiry, and value beyond school. I'll briefly mention that when people hear the term authentic in terms of authentic instruction or authentic assessment, most people relate that to the last criteria, value beyond school, that is, students deal with a problem that has a connection to the real world. While we agree with that, we also think that the other 2 criteria are just as important. Construction of knowledge, where students are using higher order thinking and analyzing, evaluating, interpreting information in new ways for them, and discipline inquiry, which involves in-depth understanding of important concepts and themes in a discipline and elaborating that understanding through different forms of communication.
Great. So we can look at a teacher's instruction, or we can look at a teacher's assignments, and we can also look at the student work that they did.
That's right. Those were the 3 different kinds of artifacts that we looked at in our research, and that's also the 3 different kinds of artifacts we now look at when we do AIW professional development with teachers and schools.
So speaking of which, I want to ask you a couple questions about this particular research here, because I know you were the lead researcher on this project. This is a study comparing kids with disabilities and without disabilities, is that right?
That's right. We did this study called the RISER study for short in the early 2000s, and that study looked closely at 4 high schools in different parts of the United States. One of those was urban, 1 was rural, and 2 were suburban small city high schools. And all 4 of these high schools had included students with disabilities in their general education classrooms to a large extent. And in this study, we collected important assignments and assessment tasks from the different teachers in these 4 schools, and we also collected the student work that went along with those assignments and assessments.
So is that, I didn't mean to interrupt, I'm just wondering, is this graph then comparing the student work, like for example, 2 schools and 2 schools, or what does lowest scoring versus highest scoring mean?
The lowest scoring columns on the left-hand side represent the classrooms where teachers' assignments scored lower on the criteria for authentic intellectual work. And the scores of 4.6 and 5.6 respectively represent the average scores for the students with disabilities and students without disabilities in those lower scoring classes. On the right-hand side, we see the highest scoring classes in terms of teacher tasks according to our criteria of AIW. And we see here that student performance on those higher scoring tasks are much higher for both students with disabilities and students without.
It looks like in both situations there's still a persistent gap.
There is. The gap has not closed altogether, but what we see here in the middle part of the graph that's circled, an important difference between the performance of students with disabilities when they are engaging in high quality tasks their performance is much higher than general ed students when those students are provided with lower level tasks.
That seems really significant. And as a knowing parents who have kids with disabilities, intuitively as a parent that teacher matters, the teacher that your child is with based on those level of expectations. But what I'm interpreting by looking at this is it's not just having high expectations, but is it actually also giving kids the opportunity to think about deeper questions, like making meaning of something rather than just memorizing.
Absolutely, absolutely. These higher expectations are held for all students in these higher scoring classes in terms of the expectations for their intellectual work. And you're right, we know that teachers do matter in terms of student learning, and what we want to see in our work with schools is teachers improving the levels of intellectual rigor and relevance that they're offering students.
So one last question before I let you go, and that is, this study, correct me if I'm wrong, did not include any professional development of the teachers that were involved. Is that correct?
That is correct. We examined teachers' practice in these 4 schools as it, quote unquote, naturally occurred. There was no intervention of professional development. And that's true of the body of research on AIW up through 2009, both in the United States and in Australia, that looks at the impact of quality of teaching and student performance. And just like the RISER study, across this body of research, we're seeing that when AIW instruction and assignments and tasks, when high quality lessons and tasks are offered to students, we see increased student performance, both measured from performance-based assessments and also more standardized assessments.
So are there a lot of teachers who have a naturally high scoring class?
That's the not so great news. Consistently, there are studies both in our work and in other work that intellectually challenging work, cognitively challenging work, intellectually rigorous classrooms are still the exception rather than the rule in schools across this country.
But it looks like the work in Iowa, we're not going to be talking about that in this little mini series, but is promising because we've done professional development with those teachers and the results seem similar. Is that a fair?
That's right. We're very optimistic that what we're seeing across now over 100 schools in Iowa, that systematic, ongoing, embedded professional development can improve teachers' practice, which in turn is improving student performance.
Wow, that's great news. Thanks so much, Bruce. I really appreciate you taking time to have this conversation.
Thanks, Dana.
Take care. Bye-bye.